So we talked about what autosomal disorders are, and in this case, or traits, these are traits or disorders that are found on the first 22 chromosomes, and sex-linked traits or disorders, they're found on the sex chromosomes, or the X and X or X and Y. So that's the difference between autosomal and sex-linked, okay? Now, how can you tell the difference between if a trait is going to be found in the first 22 chromosomes, which are autosomal, or if it's in the sex chromosomes, they are sex-linked? Well, take a look at who is affected. You got to look at their gender. So if you see that both genders are equally or pretty much equally affected, then you can say that this is an autosomal trait. It's a pedigree that shows it's autosomal. Now, take a look at this pedigree. If you count out how many men are affected, there should be 3 men that are affected because there are 3 squares that are shaded in. At the same time, there are 4 women that are affected by this trait. You know that because there's 4 circles that are shaded in. So there's about equal amounts of men and women being affected by this trait. Knowing that, that is an autosomal pedigree. Well, sometimes pedigrees you can see that mostly one gender is affected. Okay, if you see that, that would be a trait that shows a sex-linked pedigree. In this situation, you see 4 men or 4 shaded squares, okay, that means 4 men are affected, and you only see 1 circle that is shaded in or 1 female that is affected. So since mostly the males are affected, it is a sex-linked pedigree. Now pause the video and do the next example and determine if it is an autosomal pedigree or is it a sex-linked pedigree, and provide a reason for your answer. So remember we said that if it is an autosomal pedigree, both genders are affected. And if it is a sex-linked pedigree, mostly one gender is going to be affected. Looking at this pedigree, we see that there's only one gender that is being affected, and it is males because you have the squares that are shaded in. So in this case, it would be a sex-linked pedigree. Take a look at this next pedigree and pause the video and answer if it is a autosomal pedigree or sex-linked pedigree, and provide proof for your answer. In this case, this would be considered an autosomal pedigree because you have both men and women being affected by this trait equally, or about equally. So this is an autosomal pedigree. Now that you know the difference between autosomal or sex-linked pedigrees, you have to determine if the pedigree is dominant or recessive, if it shows a dominant trait or recessive trait. So in this case, to understand that, you have to take a look at the kids that are affected. If their parents are also affected, then this is a pedigree that shows a dominant trait. So that means anybody who is affected by this trait should have a dominant allele. They will either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. If you see a pedigree and it is recessive, the way to figure it out is if the kids are affected but the parents are not affected. They are normal. They don't have the trait. So in this case, if you see that, this is going to be a recessive trait. That means anybody who has the trait or disorder is going to be homozygous recessive. Now let's take a look at this pedigree. So in this case, this shows the trait Huntington's disease. Now if you don't know anything about Huntington's disease, it is a trait and it's inherited, and it causes your nerve cells in your brains to waste away. And people are born with this defective gene, but the symptoms don't usually show up until you're older. So some symptoms are you have uncontrolled movements, clumsiness, balance problems, and these are symptoms that you see earlier on. But as you get older, it's going to get harder for you to walk or talk or swallow. Sometimes people stop recognizing their family members, and they start to be less aware of their environment and their surroundings. And in this case, there is no cure for Huntington's disease. There are medications to ease the symptoms, but in this case, there's no cure for it. So this pedigree shows a family that has Huntington's disease that's running in through their generations. We can tell that this is autosomal because you can see that both men and women are equally affected by Huntington's disease. And I can tell that this is a dominant trait, that Huntington's is a dominant trait because in this case you can take a look at the kids, and their kids have parents who are affected by this trait too. So take a look at the third generation. The boy in the third generation, the boy that is shaded in, he has a father that is affected in the second generation. Now take a look at the second generation. There are two people affected, a boy and a girl. Okay, they're both brother and sister. And who did they get it from? Well, they got it from the mother in the first generation. So since Huntington's disease is a dominant trait, anybody who has Huntington's disease will have a dominant allele. They will either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. And anybody who does not have the trait will be homozygous recessive. So again, to look at this pedigree, we know that this is autosomal because both genders are equally affected, and we know that this is a dominant trait because the parents are affected and also the kids are affected too. Let's look at another example. Let's say that this pedigree shows Huntington's disease in the family. Again, we know this is an autosomal pedigree because both genders are affected. We also know that this pedigree shows a dominant trait because the affected kids have affected parents. We're going to determine the genotype of each individual. Fill in the genotypes on your paper. Since Huntington's disease is a dominant trait, anyone who is shaded in should have at least one dominant allele, so write a capital H for those individuals. We don't know if they're homozygous dominant, two capital H's, or heterozygous, a capital and a lowercase h, so we'll skip to the unaffected individuals. Since they don't have Huntington's disease, they must have a homozygous recessive genotype, two lowercase h's. Now let's go back to the affected individuals again, and let's start with the first generation. Individuals 1 and 2 in the first generation have 3 kids. They have 2 boys and a girl. What would their genotypes be in order for them to have one of their 3 kids that is unaffected? Remember that the dad gives one of the letters and the mom gives one of the letters to every child. Since they have an affected son in the second generation, one lowercase h came from dad, and then one lowercase h came from mom. So this means that both mom and dad are heterozygous. Pause the video and draw a Punnett square for these parents who are heterozygous, and what do you find out about the kids? You'll find that in the Punnett square, you're going to find that 1 out of 4 of their children will be homozygous dominant. And you're also going to find out that 2 out of 4 will be heterozygous, and 1 out of 4 will be homozygous recessive. Since they can have kids that are homozygous dominant or heterozygous, and we don't know which one they could be, we're simply going to put a capital H dash for the individuals that are affected by these parents. Now let's go back to the first generation again, but look at the couple on the right side. They have 2 children, an unaffected girl and an affected boy. What would the father's genotype be in order for the parents to have an unaffected child? Well, one lowercase h from the unaffected child came from the mom, so the other lowercase h had to come from the dad, making him heterozygous. Now let's take a look at their son. Who did he get the capital H from, his mom or his dad? The son got the capital H from the dad since he's the only one that can give that allele. Well, what did the mom give to the son? Since she can only give him a lowercase h, the son's genotype has to be heterozygous. Let's take a look at another example. Again, this is an autosomal pedigree because both genders are affected by this trait. This is also a dominant pedigree because every affected child got the trait from an affected parent. Fill in the genotypes. Those who are affected should have a capital H, and those who are not affected should be homozygous recessive. Let's take a look at the couple in the first generation. The wife is unaffected, but the husband is affected. They have 6 children. What would dad's genotype have to be in order for the couple to have 3 kids that are unaffected in the second generation? Since the mom gives one lowercase h to the unaffected kids, the dad also has to give a lowercase h, making him heterozygous. Take a look at their kids who are affected in the second generation. Who do they get a capital H from, the mom or the dad? Since the dad is the only one who can give a capital H, the mom will give out a lowercase h to the affected kids, making them heterozygous. Now let's take a look at the third generation. We have one more person to fill in their genotype. What would the daughter's genotype be? Well, she got the capital H from her mom, and the only allele she can get from her dad is a lowercase h, so she is heterozygous also. Now take a look at this next example. I want you to determine why this is an autosomal dominant pedigree, so give reasons for it. And then I want you to fill in the genotypes for every individual in this pedigree. Then show me your work.